prince betrayed his father with a hug and killed an empire. A father's dream shattered by the arms of his own son. In the icy halls of Winchester Castle, King Henry II opened his arms to Richard the Lionheart, expecting reconciliation. What he received was a whisper, a single sentence that collapsed an empire. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a masterpiece of ambition, manipulation, and medieval tragedy. What drove a prince to side with his father's greatest enemy? And what did he say that left Europe reeling in silence? Watch to uncover the moment a hug became the deadliest weapon of all. Comment: if you sensed the twist coming, like for royal intrigue, and subscribe for more untold history that cuts like a sword. In the shadowed halls of Winchester Castle, on the 13th day of March in the year 1185, King Henry II of England stood before a window that overlooked the courtyard where his knights practiced their deadly arts in the pale morning light. The sound of steel against steel rang through the air like funeral bells, and with each clash of sword upon sword, the king felt his heart break a little more, for in those metallic echoes, he heard the voice of his beloved son Richard, the boy he had raised to be a lion among men, the heir who had just shattered his father's soul with an embrace that carried within it the poison of absolute betrayal. The morning light streaming through the castle's ancient windows cast long shadows across the stone floors, shadows that seemed to Henry to represent the darkness that had fallen across his reign and his life. The king was 52 years old, an age that medieval men considered the threshold of old age. Yet until 3 days ago, he had felt himself to be in the prime of his power and influence. The Angevin Empire stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, encompassing England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and Aquitaine. No European monarch could claim dominion over such vast territories, and Henry had ruled them all with an iron fist, wrapped in the velvet glove of diplomatic cunning. The empire had been the work of a lifetime, built through strategic marriages, military conquest, and political maneuvering that had required Henry to think not in terms of months or years, but of decades and generations. Each territory had been acquired through careful planning and ruthless execution, each alliance forged through a combination of threats and promises that had taken years to negotiate and implement. The king had sacrificed his youth, his health, and in many ways his happiness to create something that would outlast his mortal existence and provide his descendants with the foundation for centuries of power and prosperity. But empires built on the ambitions of one man are inherently fragile, dependent on the continued wisdom and strength of their creators, and vulnerable to the very human weaknesses that drive men to betray their closest allies and family members. Henry had always understood this vulnerability, had spent years grooming his sons to inherit not just his territories, but his vision and his methods. He had believed, with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of successful planning, that he could shape his heirs into worthy successors who would preserve and expand what he had built. The embrace had happened 3 days earlier, in the great hall of this very castle, witnessed by dozens of nobles and chroniclers who would carry the tale across Europe like wildfire spreading through dry wheat. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of Aquitaine, heir apparent to the English throne, had walked into his father's court with the bearing of a conqueror and the smile of an angel. Henry had risen from his throne, his aged face lighting up with the joy that only a father feels when seeing his most beloved child after months of separation. The king had opened his arms wide, and Richard had stepped into that paternal embrace with tears glistening in his eyes, like morning dew on flower petals. The great hall of Winchester Castle had been filled with the cream of English and Norman nobility, men whose loyalty to the crown had been tested in countless campaigns and diplomatic crises throughout Henry's long reign. These were not courtiers who could be easily impressed or deceived by political theatre, but hardened veterans of palace intrigue who understood the subtle languages of power and could read the hidden meanings behind every gesture and word. Their presence as witnesses to the embrace between father and son gave the moment a weight and significance that would resonate throughout the medieval world. Among the observers was Geoffrey of Monmouth, the royal chronicler whose pen would record this moment for posterity, capturing not just the physical details of the embrace, but the emotional undercurrents that transformed a simple greeting between family members into a pivotal moment in European history. Geoffrey had served Henry's court for over a decade, documenting the king's triumphs and struggles with the objectivity of a trained historian. But even his professional detachment could not shield him from the emotional impact of what he was witnessing. The nobles present included some of the most powerful men in the Angevin Empire. William Marshal, the greatest knight of his generation and Henry's most trusted military advisor. Ranulph de Glanville, the chief justiciar, whose administrative reforms had revolutionized English governance, and Geoffrey Fitzpeter, the Earl of Essex, whose loyalty to the crown had never wavered despite numerous opportunities to switch sides during the various rebellions that had plagued Henry's reign. These men had watched Richard grow from a precocious child into a formidable young warrior and administrator, and their reactions to his betrayal would influence the responses of nobles throughout the empire. But as father and son held each other in what appeared to be a moment of perfect reconciliation, Richard whispered words into his father's ear that would echo through eternity, like the voice of damnation itself. His breath was warm against the king's neck, his voice soft as silk, yet the meaning of his words struck Henry with the force of an executioner's axe falling upon the block. Richard spoke of loyalty sworn to another, of homage paid to Philip Augustus of France, of a son who had chosen to stand with his father's greatest enemy, rather than defend the crown that would one day be his own. The exact words that Richard whispered to his father in that fateful embrace have been debated by historians for centuries, recorded differently by various chroniclers who claim to have witnessed the scene or spoken with those who did. Some accounts suggest that Richard simply informed his father of his alliance with Philip Augustus, while others claim that he delivered a formal renunciation of his inheritance and his ties to the English crown. The most dramatic versions of the story suggest that Richard actually quoted biblical passages about sons rising against their fathers, transforming his betrayal into a theological statement about the inevitable conflict between generations. Whatever the exact words, their impact on Henry was immediate and devastating. The king's face, which had been radiant with paternal joy just moments before, drained of all color as if his life force was being drawn out through some invisible wound. His arms, which had embraced his son with genuine warmth and affection, seemed to lose their strength, dropping to his sides as if suddenly unable to support their own weight. Most shocking to the observers was the expression that crossed Henry's features, not anger or rage as might be expected, but a profound sadness that seemed to age him decades in the space of a few heartbeats. The embrace had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but in those 10 seconds, an empire began to crumble. Henry felt his son's arms around him transform from instruments of love into the coils of a serpent, felt the warmth of filial affection drain away like blood from a mortal wound. When Richard finally stepped back, still wearing that beautiful, terrible smile, Henry saw in his son's eyes the reflection of his own destruction, the cold calculation of a young man who had weighed his father's love against political advantage and found the former wanting. The physical sensation of Richard's embrace had been real enough. The strong arms of a warrior prince who had been trained from childhood in the arts of combat and leadership. The solid weight of a young man in his prime whose presence commanded respect from seasoned knights and nervous courtiers alike. But underlying the physical contact was an emotional complexity that transformed the embrace into something far more significant than a simple greeting between family members. Henry felt in his son's arms both the boy he had once carried on his shoulders and the man who was now prepared to destroy everything his father had built. The transformation of the embrace from an expression of love into an instrument of betrayal reflected the fundamental tragedy of the Plantagenet family, their inability to separate personal relationships from political necessity. In a dynasty where sons were groomed from birth to be rivals for their father's power, and where family affection was always complicated by questions of inheritance and succession, every interaction carried the potential for both genuine emotion and calculated manipulation. Richard's embrace embodied this duality perfectly, expressing both real love for his father and absolute determination to pursue his own ambitions regardless of the cost to family loyalty. The king had said nothing in that moment, merely nodded as if Richard had whispered sweet nothings about the weather or the quality of the wine. But every person in that hall felt the temperature drop, as if winter had suddenly invaded the stone walls, felt the very air grow thick with the weight of something momentous and irreversible having just occurred. Henry II, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who ruled an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, had just been publicly humiliated by his own flesh and blood, and everyone present understood that they had witnessed not just a personal betrayal, but the beginning of a war that would reshape the medieval world. The silence that followed Richard's whispered revelation was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the assembled nobles like a heavy blanket that muffled not just sound, but thought itself. In that silence, political calculations began and ended, loyalties shifted and reformed, and the future of the Angevin Empire was decided by men who understood that they had just witnessed the beginning of the end of an era. Some of the nobles present would later claim that they had sensed the coming catastrophe from the moment Richard entered the hall, while others would swear that the betrayal came as a complete shock that left them struggling to understand how they should respond. Now, 3 days later, Henry stood alone at his window, watching his remaining loyal knights prepare for battles they might never fight, while his mind traveled backward through the years to understand how love had transformed into such exquisite hatred. He remembered Richard as a child of 7, golden-haired and fierce-eyed, demanding to be taught swordplay before he could properly mount a horse. The boy had possessed a natural grace with weapons that amazed even hardened veterans, but more than that, he had shown an intelligence and tactical instinct that marked him as destined for greatness. The memories came flooding back with the vividness that grief brings to recollections of better times, each image sharp and clear, as if preserved in crystal for exactly this moment of loss and reflection. Henry remembered the first time he had placed a real sword in Richard's hands, watching the boy's face light up with excitement and determination as he struggled to lift a weapon that was almost as tall as he was. The child had refused to accept a wooden practice sword, insisting that if he was to learn the art of war, he should do so with the tools that real warriors used. Richard's education had been comprehensive and ruthless, designed to prepare him not just for kingship, but for the specific challenges of ruling the fractured and contentious territories that made up the Angevin Empire. The boy had been taught Latin and French by the finest scholars in Europe, had studied mathematics and engineering with master builders who had constructed the most advanced fortifications of the age, and had learned strategy and tactics from knights who had campaigned in the Holy Land and Spain. But more than formal education, Richard had received something far more valuable: the personal attention and guidance of a father who saw in his son the potential for greatness that might surpass his own achievements. Henry had taken Richard with him on progresses through the empire, showing the boy every castle, every strategic river crossing, every mountain pass that might prove crucial in times of war. Father and son had ridden together through the rain-soaked fields of Normandy and the sun-baked hills of Aquitaine, Henry pointing out the economic resources and defensive advantages that made each region valuable, explaining the complex web of feudal obligations and personal relationships that held the empire together. These journeys had been both educational and bonding experiences, creating memories that Henry had treasured as evidence of the close relationship he was building with his heir. The irony was not lost on Henry that this careful education had given Richard exactly the knowledge and skills he needed to destroy what his father had built. Every castle whose defenses Henry had explained became a potential target for Richard's forces. Every strategic position whose importance Henry had demonstrated became a prize to be captured in the coming war. The maps and documents that Henry had shown his son, intending to prepare him for wise rulership, had instead become intelligence that Richard could share with Philip Augustus to plan the most effective assault on the Angevin Empire. Henry had poured his hopes and dreams into that child, like water into fertile soil, teaching him statecraft and diplomacy, military strategy, and the delicate art of ruling fractious nobles who would test any sign of weakness like wolves testing a wounded deer. The king had shared secrets of governance that he had never revealed to his other sons, had taken Richard into his confidence on matters of such importance that kingdoms could rise or fall based on their resolution. Father and son had ridden together across England and through the vast territories of the Angevin Empire, Henry showing his heir every castle, every strategic position, every source of strength that would one day be his to command. The relationship between Henry and Richard had been unique among medieval royal families for its combination of genuine affection and serious intellectual partnership. Unlike many kings who kept their heirs at arm's length until the moment of succession, Henry had actively involved Richard in the governance of the empire from an early age, seeking his opinions on policy matters and gradually increasing his responsibilities as he demonstrated his capabilities. This close collaboration had created a father-son relationship that was both personal and professional, bound together by shared challenges and mutual respect, as well as family ties. Richard's natural abilities had exceeded even Henry's optimistic expectations, revealing a mind that could grasp complex political situations with remarkable speed and a personality that could inspire loyalty from both noble lords and common soldiers. The young prince had shown an intuitive understanding of military strategy that impressed battle-hardened commanders, and a gift for languages that allowed him to communicate effectively with the diverse populations of the Angevin Empire. Most importantly, Richard had demonstrated the kind of charismatic leadership that medieval chroniclers described as the mark of kings destined for greatness. But somewhere in those golden years of preparation and partnership, something had begun to fester like a wound that appears healed on the surface while corruption spreads beneath. Henry could trace the change back to Richard's 18th birthday, when the young prince had begun to question not just his father's decisions, but his father's right to make those decisions without consultation. The boy had grown into a man of such charismatic power that knights and nobles alike were drawn to him like iron filings to a lodestone, and with that attraction had come whispers of ambition that grew louder with each passing season. The transformation had been so gradual that Henry had not recognized it until it was too late to stop. What had begun as healthy intellectual curiosity about governance and policy had evolved into systematic questioning of royal authority and traditional hierarchies. Richard had started to surround himself with advisors whose loyalty was primarily to him rather than to the crown, creating what amounted to a shadow court that operated according to different principles and priorities than the established royal administration. The young prince had also begun to cultivate relationships with foreign dignitaries and rulers, particularly with representatives of the French court, who recognized in Richard a potential ally in their struggle against Angevin dominance. These contacts had been made under the guise of diplomatic courtesy and cultural exchange, but Henry's spies had reported conversations and meetings that suggested something far more serious than polite international relations. Richard was building his own network of alliances and obligations that existed outside the traditional framework of feudal loyalty and family duty. Most troubling to Henry was Richard's growing interest in the crusading movement, which offered ambitious young nobles the opportunity to win glory and reputation through military campaigns that were both religiously sanctioned and politically advantageous. The Crusades provided a legitimate outlet for martial ambition that could not be satisfied within the confines of European politics, and Richard had begun to speak with increasing frequency about his desire to take the cross and lead Christian forces against the Muslim powers that controlled the Holy Land. The first open rebellion had come 2 years earlier, when Richard had raised his banner against his father in alliance with his brothers, Henry the Young King and Geoffrey of Brittany. That war had been fought with a savagery that shocked even a continent accustomed to brutal conflicts between family members. Brother fought against father, son drew sword against the man who had given him life, and the fields of Normandy ran red with Plantagenet blood spilled by Plantagenet hands. The Great Rebellion of 1173-1174 had been precipitated by a complex web of grievances and ambitions that reflected both personal family dynamics and larger political pressures affecting the Angevin Empire. Henry II's sons had grown increasingly frustrated with their father's refusal to delegate meaningful authority to them, despite their formal titles and theoretical positions as rulers of various territories. The young men had been given the symbols of power without its substance, creating a situation that bred resentment and encouraged them to seek real authority through rebellion rather than patient waiting for their inheritance. The rebellion had been organized with careful planning and considerable external support, demonstrating that it was not merely a spontaneous family quarrel, but a serious political movement that threatened the stability of the entire Angevin system. Louis VII of France had provided both financial support and military assistance to the rebellious princes, seeing in their revolt an opportunity to weaken his most dangerous rival and potentially reclaim territories that he considered rightfully French. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's own queen and Richard's mother, had also supported the rebellion, adding her considerable political influence and resources to the cause of her sons. The military campaigns of the rebellion had been characterized by a level of brutality that was shocking even by medieval standards, as family members who had once shared meals and hunting expeditions now sought each other's destruction with single-minded determination. Castles that had been symbols of family unity became battlegrounds where brothers fought against their father and former friends became bitter enemies. The psychological toll of the conflict was perhaps even greater than its physical costs, as the fundamental bonds of trust and affection that had held the Plantagenet family together were systematically destroyed by the necessities of warfare. Henry's response to the rebellion had demonstrated both his military genius and his personal anguish at being forced to take up arms against his own children. The king had conducted a campaign that was strategically brilliant and tactically innovative, using his superior knowledge of the terrain and his relationships with local commanders to outmaneuver forces that significantly outnumbered his own loyal troops. But even as he won battle after battle, Henry's letters and contemporary accounts suggest that he was emotionally devastated by the necessity of fighting against sons he loved and had hoped to see as his partners in governance. Henry had won that war through superior strategy and the loyalty of battle-tested veterans who remembered the chaos that had preceded his reign. But the victory had tasted like ashes in his mouth. 2 of his sons lay dead, cut down not by enemy swords, but by the diseases and accidents that stalk armies in the field like invisible harbingers of doom. Henry the young king had died of dysentery in a squalid tent, crying out for his father's forgiveness with his last breath, while Geoffrey had been trampled beneath the hooves of his own warhorse during a tournament meant to celebrate the peace that never came. The death of Henry the young king had been particularly devastating because it occurred at a moment when reconciliation between father and son seemed possible. The young man had been weakened by months of campaigning and was suffering from the intestinal disease that would eventually kill him when he sent word to his father requesting a meeting to discuss terms for ending the rebellion. Henry had rushed to his son's bedside, hoping to heal both the political crisis and the personal breach that had driven them apart, but he arrived to find the young king already delirious with fever and beyond rational conversation. The final conversation between Henry II and his eldest son had been heartbreaking in its mixture of love, regret, and lost opportunities. The young king had apparently experienced moments of clarity during which he begged his father's forgiveness for the rebellion and expressed his desire to be buried in the habit of a monk as penance for his sins. Henry had granted both requests, weeping openly as he watched his heir and namesake slip away from life, but the moment of reconciliation had come too late to repair the damage that the rebellion had inflicted on both the family and the empire. Geoffrey's death had been equally tragic, but more symbolically meaningful, occurring during a tournament that was supposed to celebrate the peace between the surviving family members. The prince had been participating in a joust when his horse stumbled and fell, crushing him beneath its weight, in full view of the assembled nobles who had come to witness what they hoped would be a new era of Plantagenet unity. The accident was so sudden and unexpected that many witnesses initially thought it was part of the entertainment, not realizing until Geoffrey failed to rise that they had just witnessed the death of a prince whose potential would never be fulfilled. Richard alone had survived, and in surviving he had learned lessons that his father wished with all his heart the boy had never needed to learn. The young prince had discovered that rebellion, even failed rebellion, could be a path to greater power if pursued with sufficient cunning and patience. He had seen how easily nobles could be swayed from their oaths of loyalty when offered the promise of advancement under a new regime. Most dangerously of all, he had learned that his father, for all his legendary reputation, was not invincible, not immortal, not the godlike figure that Richard had worshipped as a child. The survival of Richard while his brothers perished had seemed to many observers to be a sign of divine favor, marking him as the son chosen by God to inherit his father's empire and perhaps expand it beyond even Henry's impressive achievements. Richard himself appeared to interpret his survival in this light, developing a sense of destiny and invulnerability that would characterize his behavior for the rest of his life. The young prince had emerged from the rebellion, not humbled by its failure, but emboldened by his ability to survive its consequences and convinced that future efforts would be more successful. The lessons that Richard drew from the Great Rebellion were fundamentally different from those that his father hoped he would learn. While Henry had intended the conflict to demonstrate the futility of challenging established authority and the importance of family unity, Richard had instead learned about the weaknesses in his father's position and the possibilities for exploiting those weaknesses more effectively in future conflicts. The young prince had observed which nobles were most susceptible to persuasion, which territories were most vulnerable to rebellion, and which foreign powers were most willing to support challenges to Angevin authority. The reconciliation that followed that first war had been genuine, or so Henry had believed. Father and son had embraced on the battlefield where their armies had faced each other in the final confrontation, and tears had flowed down both their faces as they swore to put aside the madness that had driven them to take up arms against each other. Richard had knelt before his father and renewed his oath of fealty in words that rang with apparent sincerity, and Henry had raised his son to his feet and promised forgiveness for all that had passed between them. The ceremony of reconciliation had been witnessed by hundreds of knights and nobles from both sides of the conflict, creating a public spectacle that was designed to demonstrate the restoration of family unity and the end of the civil war that had devastated the Angevin Empire. The ritual had included all the traditional elements of feudal submission and forgiveness. Richard kneeling before his father to acknowledge his subordinate status, Henry placing his hands on his son's head to signify acceptance of the oath, and both men exchanging the kiss of peace that symbolized the restoration of their relationship. The emotional content of the reconciliation had seemed genuine to all who witnessed it, as both father and son appeared to be moved to tears by the restoration of their relationship and the end of the warfare that had caused so much destruction and suffering. Contemporary chroniclers described the scene as deeply moving, with hardened warriors weeping openly as they watched the reunion of the royal family and the apparent resolution of the crisis that had threatened to tear the empire apart. For a time, it had seemed as if the nightmare was truly over. Richard had proven himself a capable administrator of his Duchy of Aquitaine, ruling the fractious southern territories with a combination of diplomatic skill and military prowess that even his father had to admire. The young prince had led successful campaigns against rebellious vassals, had negotiated trade agreements that filled the royal coffers with gold, and had displayed the kind of mature judgment that marked him as ready to inherit his father's crown. Richard's administration of Aquitaine had been particularly impressive because the duchy was one of the most difficult territories in the Angevin Empire to govern effectively. The region was characterized by strong traditions of local autonomy, a complex web of competing feudal obligations, and a population that was culturally distinct from the Norman and English territories that formed the core of Henry's power. Previous attempts to impose direct royal control over Aquitaine had failed because rulers had not understood the need to balance central authority with respect for local customs and privileges. Richard's success in governing Aquitaine had demonstrated his ability to adapt his methods to local conditions while still maintaining the overall unity and coherence of the Angevin system. The young prince had learned to speak the Occitan language fluently, had cultivated relationships with local troubadours and cultural leaders, and had shown respect for the traditions of courtly love and chivalric culture that were central to Aquitanian identity. At the same time, he had maintained firm control over military affairs and had not hesitated to use force against vassals who challenged his authority or threatened the peace of the duchy. The economic prosperity that Aquitaine enjoyed under Richard's rule had been particularly noteworthy, as the young prince had implemented policies that encouraged trade while maintaining the tax revenues necessary to support his military and administrative expenses. Richard had negotiated favorable trade agreements with Italian city-states, had improved the infrastructure of roads and bridges that facilitated commerce, and had established new markets and fairs that attracted merchants from across Europe. These economic achievements had earned him the loyalty of the merchant classes and had provided the financial resources necessary to maintain his position as one of the most powerful nobles in the Angevin Empire. The young prince had led successful campaigns against rebellious vassals, had negotiated trade agreements that filled the royal coffers with gold, and had displayed the kind of mature judgment that marked him as ready to inherit his father's crown. But beneath the surface, the cancer of ambition continued to grow. Richard began to cultivate relationships with foreign princes, particularly with Philip Augustus of France, the young king whose intelligence matched Richard's own and whose hatred for Henry II burned with the intensity of a forge fire. The two young men found in each other kindred spirits, princes whose destinies seemed too large to be contained within the traditional boundaries of feudal obligation and filial duty. The relationship between Richard and Philip Augustus represented one of the most significant diplomatic developments of the late 12th century, as it brought together two of the most capable and ambitious young rulers in Europe in an alliance that would reshape the balance of power across the continent. Philip had inherited the French throne at the age of 15 and had quickly demonstrated a political acumen that belied his youth, while Richard had established himself as one of the premier military commanders of his generation through his campaigns in Aquitaine and his participation in the Great Rebellion. The friendship between the two princes had begun during diplomatic negotiations over territorial disputes in the Vexin, a strategically important region that lay on the border between French and Norman territories. Both young men had been present during the complex negotiations that followed the Great Rebellion, and they had apparently discovered a mutual respect for each other's intelligence and abilities that transcended the political differences between their families. Contemporary sources describe their relationship in terms that suggest both genuine personal affection and calculated political alliance. Philip had been barely 20 when he inherited the French throne, but he possessed a mind that could see political possibilities generations into the future. He understood that the Angevin Empire represented an existential threat to French independence, that as long as Henry II controlled more French territory than the French king himself, the Capetian dynasty would remain junior partners in their own kingdom. Philip needed allies within the Plantagenet family, and in Richard he found not just an ally, but a weapon that could be turned against the very heart of Henry's power. The strategic vision that drove Philip's courtship of Richard was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. As the young French king was essentially attempting to engineer the destruction of the most powerful monarchy in Europe through the corruption of its heir apparent, Philip understood that military conquest of the Angevin Empire would be virtually impossible, given the resources and defensive advantages that Henry commanded, but he also recognized that the empire's dependence on family unity and feudal loyalty created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through careful political manipulation. The psychological profile of Philip Augustus reveals a ruler whose intelligence was matched by his patience and his willingness to pursue long-term strategies that might take decades to bear fruit. Unlike many medieval monarchs who focused on immediate military or territorial gains, Philip was prepared to invest years in building the relationships and creating the conditions that would eventually allow him to achieve his larger goals. His cultivation of Richard represented the culmination of this approach, as he recognized that turning Henry's heir against him would be far more effective than any military campaign. The seduction of Richard was accomplished not through gold or promises of land, but through something far more intoxicating, the promise of glory that would echo through the ages. Philip spoke to Richard of crusades that would liberate the Holy Land, of battles that would be remembered when the names of lesser kings had been forgotten, of a destiny that transcended the petty boundaries of European politics. He painted visions of Richard as a new Alexander, a Christian warrior whose conquests would span continents and whose name would be spoken with reverence by generations yet unborn. The appeal of the crusading ideal to a young prince like Richard cannot be understated, as it offered everything that ambitious medieval nobles craved: military glory, religious justification, and the possibility of achieving fame that would outlast their mortal existence. The First Crusade had demonstrated that European knights could achieve spectacular victories in the Holy Land, winning both temporal power and eternal salvation through their service to God. The idea of leading a new crusade appealed to Richard's desire for achievement that would surpass even his father's impressive conquests. Philip's presentation of the crusading opportunity was masterfully crafted to appeal to Richard's specific psychological needs and ambitions. The French king emphasized that a successful crusade would establish Richard as the greatest Christian warrior of his generation, earning him a place in history alongside legendary figures like Charlemagne and Godfrey of Bouillon. More importantly, Philip suggested that leadership of a crusade would provide Richard with the moral authority and international recognition necessary to challenge his father's dominance and establish himself as an independent power in European politics. The religious dimension of the crusading appeal was particularly powerful for a young man who had been raised in the intensely Christian culture of medieval Europe and who understood that divine approval was essential for any ruler who hoped to maintain the loyalty of his subjects. Philip presented the crusade not as an act of rebellion against Richard's father, but as obedience to a higher authority, allowing the young prince to justify his betrayal in terms of religious duty and divine commandment. This theological framework provided Richard with the moral justification he needed to overcome his feelings of family loyalty and filial obligation. The practical political advantages of crusading leadership were equally compelling, as Philip explained how command of a crusading army would provide Richard with resources and alliances that could make him independent of his father's support and potentially powerful enough to challenge Angevin authority directly. A successful crusade would bring Richard into contact with the Byzantine Empire, the Italian city-states, and other Mediterranean powers that could provide alternative sources of funding and military support for his ambitions. Philip's vision of Richard as a new Alexander was particularly seductive because it offered the young prince a historical model that transcended the limitations of contemporary European politics. Alexander the Great had conquered much of the known world before his 30th birthday, establishing an empire that stretched from Macedonia to India and earning a reputation that had endured for over 1,000 years. The comparison suggested that Richard could achieve similar greatness if he was willing to think beyond the traditional boundaries of Western European feudalism and pursue conquests that would establish him as a world historical figure. Henry watched his son's gradual transformation with the helpless horror of a physician witnessing the progress of an incurable disease. Richard's visits to the English court became less frequent and more formal, his conversations with his father increasingly distant and perfunctory. The young prince began to surround himself with advisors whose loyalty was questionable, men whose ambitions aligned more closely with French interests than with the preservation of the Angevin Empire. The change in Richard's behavior was subtle at first, manifesting itself in small alterations in protocol and etiquette that might have been dismissed as the natural evolution of a young man growing into his role as a major territorial lord. Richard began to insist on being addressed by his full ducal titles in formal settings, to maintain his own separate household with its own ceremonial traditions, and to conduct diplomatic correspondence without always seeking his father's prior approval. These changes seemed reasonable enough individually, but collectively suggested a growing desire for independence that went beyond the normal development of an adult heir. More troubling to Henry were the reports from his intelligence network about Richard's activities when he was away from the English court. The young prince was meeting with foreign dignitaries without informing his father, was receiving embassies from rival powers, and was apparently engaging in negotiations that went far beyond the normal scope of ducal authority. Most concerning were the reports of secret meetings with French representatives, including personal communications with Philip Augustus himself, that suggested a level of coordination and planning that went far beyond casual diplomatic contact. The composition of Richard's household and advisory circle also began to change in ways that reflected his shifting loyalties and priorities. The young prince gradually replaced advisors who had been appointed by his father with men whose primary loyalty was to Richard personally rather than to the Angevin system. These new advisors included knights who had served in the Holy Land, scholars who had studied in French universities, and administrators whose experience was primarily in territories that were contested between French and Angevin authority. The most significant change in Richard's entourage was the inclusion of several clerics, who were known for their enthusiasm for the crusading movement and their belief that secular rulers had obligations to the church that superseded their duties to temporal overlords. These religious advisors provided Richard with theological justifications for prioritizing crusading service over family loyalty, and their presence in his household sent a clear signal about the young prince's evolving priorities and commitments. The breaking point came when Henry announced his intention to lead a new crusade to the Holy Land, a grand expedition that would unite the Christian kingdoms of Europe under his leadership and secure his place in history as the liberator of Jerusalem. It was to be the crowning achievement of his reign, the legacy that would overshadow all the petty wars and political maneuverings that had defined his rule. Henry had assumed that Richard would stand beside him in this great enterprise, that father and son would ride together into the pages of legend, as they had once ridden together across the fields of their earthly domains. Henry's announcement of his crusading intentions represented both the culmination of his lifelong ambitions and a desperate attempt to reclaim his relationship with Richard by offering the young prince the very thing that Philip Augustus had been promising him. The king understood that his son's interest in the crusading movement was one of the primary sources of tension between them, and he hoped that by proposing to lead a crusade himself, he could satisfy Richard's ambitions while maintaining family unity and Angevin control over the expedition. The timing of Henry's crusading announcement was no accident. It was a final, desperate chess move from a king who still believed he could outmaneuver fate. He had orchestrated it to maximum effect, revealing his plans before the full court. Bishops, barons, knights, and emissaries gathered in solemn expectation. It was a scene crafted with care, a stage on which Richard would be forced to make a choice, not in whispers but before the eyes of the empire. Would he take up the cross beside his father and restore their fractured bond? Or would he cast his lot with Philip Augustus, the king who offered glory without loyalty? The scale of the gamble was immense. Henry wagered not just his legacy, but the very unity of the Angevin Empire on that moment. But when Richard rose to speak, the silence was heavier than stone. What followed would not only seal a father's heartbreak, it would tilt the balance of Europe for a generation to come. A hug meant to heal became the blow that broke an empire. King Henry II's tears marked the death of a dynasty's unity, while Richard's ambition ignited a fire that would consume Europe's balance of power. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, where words could wound deeper than steel. If you felt the heartbreak, the tension, and the legacy of that whispered moment, comment your thoughts below. Like this video to support deep dives into real history, and subscribe for more stories where the past strikes like lightning.